Tengo el gusto de presentarles nuevamente a Veli Mitova. Ella es profesora de filosofía y directora del Centro Africano de Epistemología y Filosofía de la Ciencia de la Universidad de Johannesburgo. Es investigadora principal del proyecto La filosofía a través del conocimiento indígena en el sur global, financiado por el Instituto Nacional de Humanidades de Sudáfrica y Ciencias Sociales. Y es colaboradora del proyecto de reparaciones epistémicas financiado por el Northwestern Buffet Institute. Es un concepto que me ha impresionado muy favorablemente, el concepto de reparaciones epistémicas. You might want to talk about that as well. Veli trabaja en la intersección entre la epistemología, la ética y la epistemología social. Actualmente su atención se concentra en la injusticia epistémica, la descolonización del conocimiento y las formas en que debiéramos repensar conceptos epistemológicos normativos centrales como el riesgo epistémico, la culpa, la responsabilidad y la experiencia. Es autora de libros muy importantes como Believable Evidence, publicado por la Universidad de Cambridge el año 2017, y es editora de Epistemic Decolonization, publicado el año 2020, y The Factive Turn in Epistemology, también publicado por la Universidad de Cambridge en el año 2018. Antes de unirse a la Universidad de Johannesburgo el año 2015, Veli enseñó e investigó en la Universidad de Viena, en la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, en la Universidad de Rhodes, que es su alma mater, y en la Universidad de Cambridge, donde obtuvo su doctorado. Su ponencia de esta mañana se titula Descolonizando la filosofía, lecciones de Sudáfrica. Con ustedes, entonces, Veli Mitova.
Thank you so much, Pablo, for this introduction and for having me here. It's been a dream of mine to come to Peru actually for 30 years. So you've made that come true. Is this off? Okay. I must also apologize for speaking in English. It was 15 years since I went to Mexico, so my Spanish is super rusty. But thank you very much for having me, and Pablo did an amazing job at helpfully translating my slides, so thank you. So what I want to do today is share with you some of my experiences in decolonizing philosophy, both in research in terms of the Geography of Philosophy project and in teaching. And you might think, well, whoa, what is this white person from South Africa talking about? Where is the decolonial credentials here? And I stand accused. I have a couple of things sort of in my speaking in my favor, a little bit better than my white South Africanness. One of them is that I'm a rather enthusiastic convert. Sorry, let me just time this so that I don't abuse your patience. I'm a rather enthusiastic convert from kind of standard Anglo-analytic epistemology into a much more practically oriented decolonial kind of research. And this came about in 2015 when I came back to South Africa from various travels that Pablo was describing, and I went slap bang into these the student protests on Rhodes Must Fall, which quickly went into the movement Fees Must Fall, and as you can imagine, as being nice South Africans, it didn't go down too well with the authorities. So students were being suppressed quite brutally, actually. And so I thought I was writing a book on the Believable Evidence book on the nature of reasons and evidence, and I thought, I can't work on this stuff. Look at what's going on. Like, aren't we going to do something with this philosophical expertise? to help. And so I'm a convert, and that's kind of speaks in favor of my decolonial credentials. I also, for my sins, had to direct the philosophy department for 3 years at the height of decolonizing the curriculum. So that's also counts for something. And some of the experiences I'll be sharing with you are based on that. And finally, I'm currently, as Pablo said, I'm directing the Center for the African Center for Epistemology and Philosophy of Science, which, according to its website, says that we're in the business of decolonizing knowledge, and we know that websites don't lie, right? So I must know what this is about. So what I want to do is first theorize a little bit what I mean by decolonizing philosophy, and then I'll talk a little bit about decolonizing research, in particular the kinds of potentials and opportunities that the Geography of Philosophy project had in this broader global movement to decolonize, and then I'll focus on some of the mostly bad moves, but some good moves as well that I made as head of Department of Philosophy and as a lecturer in teaching. And finally, I'll kind of wrap up. So what do we mean by decolonizing any discipline? And here I take my lead from a kind of conception of decolonization that's increasingly becoming popular in Africa. And so there are two levels to it. One of them is epistemic decolonization, and the other one is linguistic or conceptual decolonization. And the epistemic decolonization starts with the idea that the knowledge enterprise needs to be recentered to one's socio-political here and now. And this means that people of a particular geographical site, like South Africa or Peru, have the right and the ability to think and theorize from the geographical and political space that they find themselves in. And that means that we get to choose what kinds of interests we have, what kind of intellectual interests we're going to pursue, and how we're going to pursue them in line with the broader interests of this place, instead of having them imposed from the global north on us. And this idea crops up in many colonial sites. So in Africa, here's, for example, Sheol Bembe saying that we need to reject, I need to read this, to reject the assumption that the modern West is the central root of Africa's consciousness and cultural heritage, as well as the notion that Africa is merely an extension of the West. And of course, in your neck of the woods, there's much older decolonial scholarship. But before I say this, let me just say that this is something that I will discuss in relation to how the Geography of Philosophy project contributes to the broader decolonization project. Okay, so that's the conception in Africa. The older decolonial scholarship in Latin America, one of the representatives of which is Quijano, but I didn't know that actually his grandson was studying here, so I would have gotten a quote for that. But Walter Mignolo, at all events, who's also a very famous Latin American decolonial theorist, thinks of so-called epistemic disobedience, and he thinks of that as the kind of rejection of a very universalist, supposedly neutral conception of knowledge, which sells itself as objective and kind of site neutral and unspecific, but in fact is just the reflection of the geopolitical location of roughly the white male of the global north. And this is something that, again, where I'm going to discuss in relation to the Geography of Philosophy project, where it also undermines this kind of universal conception, or at least questions it. So that's the second side of decolonial scholarship that conceives of decolonization as a kind of recentering of the knowledge enterprise. And finally, in India, even though when I was there, people in India told me that actually only Indians who live outside India theorize decolonization. But anyway, here's a counterexample to that, Patra Chatterjee, who urges Indians as early as the 90s to find their voices as producers instead of consumers of knowledge. And he makes a very nice connection between one's place in the social hierarchy, either globally or within one's country, and the kinds of power relations that come with this, and one's place in the overall knowledge economy. So he says, somehow, from the very beginning, we had a shrewd guess that given the close complicity between modern knowledges and modern regimes of power, we would forever remain consumers of universal modernity, never would be taken seriously as its producers. So part of recentering the knowledge enterprise means that the rest of the world takes you seriously as a producer of knowledge, and you're contributing to global solutions and global problems. So that's what I mean by epistemic decolonization, a kind of recentering the knowledge enterprise. But I think that decolonizing philosophy also involves an influential idea by Kwasi Wiredu, which is, well, a bunch of ideas to do with so-called conceptual decolonization. And the way he conceives of conceptual decolonization is, I quote, the elimination from our thought of modes of conceptualization that came to us through colonization and remain in our thinking owing to inertia rather than to our own reflective choices. So that's how he thinks about it. And he gives a very nice rationale for why we should be conceptually decolonizing, which has to do with the kinds of languages that have been imposed in colonial sites. So I'm going to quote him at a little bit of a length. So he says, languages carry their own kinds of philosophical suggestiveness, which foreign as well as native speakers are apt to take for granted. If, by virtue of a colonial history, you're trained right from the beginning in a foreign language, then certain basic ways of thought that seem natural to native speakers might become natural to you too. Consequently, you might not even realize that those ways of thinking may not be all that natural, or if your own language is radically different, even coherent from the standpoint of your own language. And he spent his career developing or expounding on the kinds of odd things that we get. So his first language is Akan, and he's analyzed various epistemology concepts as well as other concepts, but let me focus on those, each of which, the kinds of questions that are being asked in Anglo-American philosophy, make absolutely no sense in Akan. And if you know any epistemology, you will see that these are the main concepts that epistemologists care about: belief, doubt, faith, knowledge itself. He doesn't, interestingly enough, he doesn't list wisdom, but yeah. So he has some really fun papers in which he describes what happens when you ask certain of the questions that we ask in English in the Akan context, and it's just completely nonsensical. So the point is that conceptual decolonization is necessary because the kinds of questions you ask are fixed by your conceptual resources and the kinds of questions you find interesting. And this is something where, again, the geography of philosophy, I think, will have a lot to contribute. So, taking all of these thoughts together from epistemic and conceptual decolonization, I think we get an idea of philosophy, decolonizing philosophy, as at least involving foregrounding the voices, the philosophical voices of the site at which you are. So I'm just putting it as a G here, and reviving the epistemic authority of the voices of the site, in line with, and now I'm just summarizing what I said, so in terms of epistemic decolonization, in line with rejecting a kind of universalist conception of knowledge that pretends to be universal, but actually is just a reflection of the global north that then gets imposed on the global south. To stop treating the global south in this case, thinking as an extension of global north thinking, and allowing or letting or whatever less colonial word you can think of the global south to actually contribute to the production of the global production of knowledge. And then from conceptual decolonization, we get that decolonizing philosophy involves allowing the epistemic resources of this philosophical site to, at least to the local resources, to make at least some kind of mark, and not to just inherit unquestioningly colonial resources, epistemic resources. So this is what I'm going to mean by decolonizing philosophy. And then I now have a look at how we've done with the geography of philosophy. And I'm going to first discuss the potential that the Geography of Philosophy project has and some of the opportunities that we've discovered as time went by, and then I'll indicate the way forward arrogantly. But there you have it. Okay, so the potential of the Geography of Philosophy, as you may guess from what I've been saying so far, but let me just say that apart from Pablo's introduction, let me also introduce the project in the way that its PIs introduce it in a paper of theirs, and they say that it's an ambitious project which empirically investigates the concepts of knowledge, understanding, and wisdom across cultures, languages, regions, and socioeconomic groups. And I'm highlighting the ambitiousness of it because it really is, and it's amazing. Edouard definitely underplayed his role in all of this by saying it was all the team leaders. He spent a lot of sleepless nights coordinating these beautiful team leaders, and it's been a massive project, and huge kudos to you. And it has been ambitious. So the starting point of this project intellectually is this kind of view of philosophy as what we call armchair. I don't know if you have the same expression in Spanish, but armchair philosophy, where you're just philosophizing from the chair. So basically, the starting assumption of the project is saying, stop assuming that all of these philosophical concepts are universal. And once you stop assuming that, if they're not universal, then you need to find out, well, empirically, how these concepts work from site to site. And that's the main agenda of so-called experimental philosophy. And the motivation that the authors give in that paper is threefold, but I'm just going to focus on the last one, and that is that this is a really important project for how you do philosophy, whether our concepts are universal or not. And this is how it connects up to everything I've been saying so far. So from the conceptual decolonization point of view, remember Kwasi Wiredu saying that certain ways of thinking fix what you find interesting and not interesting and the kinds of questions you're asking in philosophy. And then from the epistemic decolonization point of view, I cited Walter Mignolo, who wants to reject this universalist conception of knowledge. And here's where the geography of philosophy is amazing at that, right? So like it does precisely that, or at least it says, let's go question these things. Here are some of the things that we've learned, and I think that progressively we've all learned them, and you know, maybe Pablo can comment as well on that, whether it was the same here, but I think we've agreed on it before. And that is that we still very much tend to use or impose global north ways of thinking, even while trying to test for non-global north ways of thinking, right? And And I'm going to give you 3 examples from the project where that became obvious to pretty much all of us. And one of them was the demographic questions that we ask people. So here's one of the, and basically we're just asking, we're imposing assumptions about income from the prosperous West in these demographic questions. So here's the example. What is the annual income of your household? And I don't know if you can read this. So the minimum is 15 to 25,000 US dollars, and then the maximum is over 150,000. Here's what we ask in South Africa. What is your monthly income? It doesn't matter, of your household. The same question, basically. And here are the equivalent numbers, right? So the minimum here is under 700 US dollars annually. And so it goes. And the second best is, sorry, this didn't come out for some reason. The second best income bracket is actually the lowest income bracket that we're asking people in the demographic questionnaires. So it's only here that you get, here that you get to the minimum amount that we're asking in the questionnaires. That's one thing that one way in which we're imposing assumptions from the prosperous West or global North or whatever you want to call it. The second one is in one of our studies, we were using the kinds of images we were using. So we were using primarily images from, in this case, we were using images from 90s British magazines of all white people. And then in the videos, there was hardly, it looked, it was kind of like it was kind of diverse, but there weren't, for example, many black people, and most of the diverse people were actually from places that get racialized as non-white in the U.S. and in Europe, but in the global South, they would not be racialized and as not white. Okay, what's the point? I think that this messed with our good intentions in various ways. And first of all, the optics weren't great because it created the impression that we cared about representing many groups and we cared about representing the global South, while actually we were still kind of trapped within the global North categories. I think the science didn't do good either because it kind of skewed the results. So if you're not familiar with certain kinds of faces, like in South Africa, if you're just being given white people mostly, not that South Africans are not familiar, they're too familiar with white faces, but in the wrong way. But the point is that if you're not sure whether when people are judging emotional reactions, they're doing it, they actually, the results that we are generating are reflective of their not being familiar with these expressions or their genuine results in differences in conceptions. And finally, as we know, the ethical problems with this kind of way of doing things, because as Du Bois and Charles Mills and a lot of other critical race theorists have taught us, this kind of normalizes whiteness. It says, here's the standard, and then everything else is supposed to somehow match up to that. And it perpetuates the very kinds of patterns of oppression that we want to undermine when we are decolonizing or when we're questioning universal assumptions. And the third way in which we were clearly imposing Western categories or global North categories was probably the least obvious and the most interesting. And sorry, I didn't get this translated, but basically a young man is deciding whether to help his neighbor to sow his field. And so we were asking people with vignettes like these, trying to gauge their reactions to what they consider to be wise choices. And And so we would give them a vignette like this, and then we would give them 4 options for what kind of methods they would choose to deliberate in this kind of situation. Sorry, not to deliberate. How they would decide whether to help the neighbor or not in this kind of situation. And one of them was deliberation. The second one was intuition, where you consult your feelings and your emotions. The third one was consulting close others. And the fourth one was consulting as many people as you can, regardless of whether you know them or not. And then here are the questions that we asked them. So firstly, we asked them how they would handle the situation. Sorry, no, which situation they consider wisest. I'm sorry, so that's the top question there. Which way of handling the situation they would use, the participant in the study. Which way would most people from your cultural background use, and to what extent would choosing each way to handle the situation make you feel good about yourself? So these were the questions that we were asking in this study. And in South Africa, I think it was only in South Africa that we got these odd results. Like so 60% when it came to answering the question, which way would you handle the situation? 60% thought it was best to handle it by deliberating, and then here's the ranking afterwards. But when we asked them the third question, so which way would make you feel best about yourself, would make you feel good about yourself, we got completely opposite results, where the first choice there was consulting those close to you, which was the last choice on the previous question, and so on. So everything was flipped around, and it was like, okay, what is going on here? And my postdoc and I had some ideas about what may have happened. One of them was, well, the studies were using 2 potentially really foreign conceptual categories, and not quite conceptual categories, but the way they were framing the thing was odd from a cultural and conceptual point of view. So the first oddity was to give people the exclusive choice between deliberation and intuition and close others and many others, the wisdom of crowds or whatever. So this is where we get A, B, C, and D. So what was really missing from the choices that were being given was consult with your family. So that could be potentially under close others, but in South Africa, families are complicated things, and they're like huge clans, and so it's not like these nuclear families, so they can't really be, this option can't be subsumed under consulting close others. There was nothing about consulting one's ancestors, which is a very obvious choice in South Africa, and there was nothing about consulting one's elders, maybe the elders in the village or something like this, which is again a common way of consulting in South Africa. So that was the first potentially odd thing. The second thing was the use of these Likert scales, where you asked to say whether you agree or you strongly agree or very strongly agree or super strongly agree or whatever. So they like these scales. And apparently both India and South African translators said, well, yeah, we have words for these things, but they're kind of meaningless in practice. So like no native speaker of isiZulu or Sepedi or Mete would actually use these categories or even knows what to do with them. And so we thought that might be also might account for these contradictions in the results. I mean, that's all in the assumption that we are rational people, right? So like, and that we do kind of, I mean, that's probably a problem assumption, but I don't see why South Africa should be like any more irrational than other places, right? So maybe that's what was going on here. So these are the kinds of things that we learned, and then you might think, well, that is so unfair on the GPP, and I'm completely right, because, well, you need some kind of uniformity in order to actually gauge whether the differences you're picking up are differences in the same concept, right? So, sorry, that's what it says now. And given that we're starting with these global north concepts and in English, then it makes sense that we're going to be imposing these categories up front so that we can see across sites whether there are any variations in them. So that's one potential criticism of like, well, you know, how are you expecting to not have uniformity? And the other one is that actually the Geography Philosophy project had very cool studies, like Study 1, that was developed by Leila, which actually invited people to think about the cultural categories, sorry, the linguistic categories that they were using. So they were being asked questions like this. They were really trying to pick up on, I mean, what philosophers would call like family resemblance concepts, I guess, and like to really locate and to do it in a way that didn't invite global north categories up front. So, yes, absolutely. That's why the Geography Philosophy project is so awesome. So it had these things, but I'm saying let's have more of them, right? So, given that the project is over, what my postdoc Joe Rayer and I did was to apply to our university for a new small grant to explore these ideas. And the starting intuition was, well, you know, so apart from giving these options, these 4 options, add another one. Say, what other way would you use of thinking about the issue, about this issue, and please tell us what it is. So here's what we did in this grant, well, pilot project really, and this was not nearly as ambitious as the Geography of Philosophy, but what we wanted, it had an ambitious title, Decolonizing Experimental Philosophy. What we were really doing is decolonizing one study in the Geography of Philosophy project, and the aim was to do so by decolonizing at least some of the wisdom studies, like the one that I showed you about the young man deciding how to help his neighbor, or whether to help his neighbor. Sorry. And we did so by doing 3 things. We wanted to explore the appropriateness of the kind of categories that we were using in the Geography of Philosophy study, the wisdom study. We wanted to explore the appropriateness of the vignettes that we're using, like the one that I showed you, and then we wanted to create a new vignette. And we're only in phase 1 of the project for various reasons, and that's a qualitative phase that involves in-depth interviews about wisdom and the kinds of choices we're supposed to be, how to take wise decisions. So you can see that I'm beginning to stumble here because I'm not actually. So it's Joe Rayer who's running this project, so that's why I'm a little humming and hawing here. But anyway, so the idea was and is to. So she created a guide. Let me just read this so I don't. So she created an interview guide on the basis of the original questionnaire and in consultation with Sepedi and isiZulu speakers. So these are 2 of our main African languages in South Africa. And then this interview guide was then translated in both Sepedi and isiZulu. And a total of 12 in-depth interviews were conducted in Sepedi, isiZulu, and English. And then we presented people with various scenarios in which it was necessary to take a decision, and then we described these scenarios, and then people discussed in these scenarios in relation to the kinds of decisions that they would take, how they would manage the situation, and how their culture would tend to react in a situation like this. And fourthly, which people would be consulted, and finally, which way of deciding would be considered in their culture the wisest. And so, as I say, we've only done phase one, but there were two interesting preliminary results, and one of them was that both Zulu and Sepedi speakers thought that the existing categories in the vignettes and the questionnaires did not correctly capture wise choices and the notion of wisdom in their community. So the far more preferable and wiser kinds of choices were considered ones that consulted with people with lots of experience, so elders and so on. And interestingly, people in particular power positions, so kings, pastors, and spiritual leaders. So that's what people were saying. And so the next phase is going to be quantitative, and we're going to include a category on consulting elders or something like that, or consulting those with lots of experience. So that's what I was suggesting earlier, that you just include another category based on these discussions with native speakers. And the second result that we found is that two scenarios kept from the various vignettes that were being shown, two scenarios kept being considered as the most important kind of cases in which you make decisions. The first one is where and when and whether to study. And where and what to study, which is already an existing vignette, and that's probably not too surprising because we're working with student populations. But the second one was about marriage, like a whole bunch of issues to do with marriage. And in South Africa, I'm not sure how it is here, but marriage is a really complicated thing with like a long ritual process of approaching the family, of gifts and so on. And so that turned out to be one of the places where people want to really think about about wisdom, like that was really important for them. And so we're going to, in phase two, include a whole bunch of questions about taking decisions about marriage, including a totally new vignette. So this was my experience with decolonizing research in the context of the geography of philosophy. So let me just summarize. If you remember, I set up a couple of criteria for how to decolonize philosophy up front, and then compare how the geography of philosophy, including this follow-up study, does against those. So if you remember, the criteria were that the philosophy in a particular geographical space has to restore the epistemic authority of the philosophical voices of that space. And that meant reject the universalist conception of knowledge, alla Mignolo, stop treating the thought of that place as an extension of the West or the global North, allow or make space, or whatever you want to use, that the thought of that space contributes to the global knowledge economy, and finally reject those conceptual resources that are imposed and have been kind of thoughtlessly inherited from colonialism. So the geography of philosophy is obviously super cool when it comes to rejecting the universalist conception, although ironically it turned out that actually there were quite a lot of universal similarities in the concepts, but the point is not to dictate what the results will be. The point is that we just reject the starting assumption that we should treat everyone as universal, sharing universal concepts, and geography of philosophy does that. Similarly, it does not treat the global South's thinking as an extension of the global North. And it obviously also rejects the idea that we should just mindlessly accept the colonial resources, epistemic resources, and conceptual resources. Where we thought that there could be more work done is in allowing Global South sites to contribute more to the broader knowledge enterprise, as well as perhaps giving more epistemic authority to the Global South sites by allowing to develop this kind of. The way we're running the conversation was in terms of top-down and bottom-up, but so allowing conceptual categories to come from the Global South sites themselves rather than being imposed. But all in all, it's a bright future ahead. Let's hope that we apply for another grant and decolonize even more. So that was my experience with research. And now in the next 20 minutes, I want to tell you a little bit about my experience with decolonizing the curriculum. And first I'm going to zoom into the enemy to this kind of decolonization. And then I'm going to share I'm going to only share some of the many bad moves that I made in that context, both as a lecturer and the head of department. And then some ambivalent moves that have some promise, but weren't quite there yet, and then I'll share some good moves that we made. So here's the enemy to the decolonizing curriculum enterprise. So we're sitting in a staff meeting with the department. I'm the head of the department, and I say, this curriculum is alienating our students. And a male white colleague says, this has nothing to do with the feelings and experiences of our students. This is philosophy. Okay, so that's the enemy as far as I'm concerned to curricular decolonization. Because we know that this has everything to do with experiences and feelings, right? Especially of our students. We know from Black feminist, decolonial standpoint, feminist theories, for the last 50 years, theorist, that your social place and your geopolitical place determines your place in knowledge production. Why? Because it determines the kinds of power relations in which you are embroiled and who gets to count as a producer of knowledge and who doesn't. Similar idea from Charles Mills, whom I cited earlier, who we also know about white ignorance, which is the deliberate ignorance of the experiences of marginalized people. And we know what the purpose of this ignorance is. It's to kind of free the white person of guilt for all this colonial and slave past to which we owe our success. And therefore remain kind of morally pure and sanitized. So that's the point. So we know that from the philosophy of ignorance. Further work, more recent work from José Medina, who has theorized very nicely the kinds of vices that actively ignorant people need to maintain in order to maintain their privilege and their sense of purity and goodness. And finally, even more recent stuff, again coming from Black feminist epistemologists like Christy Dodson, have theorized this under the umbrella of contributory injustice. So the idea that some people don't get, their epistemic resources don't get the right uptake from the mainstream knowledge economy. And so they never get to contribute knowledge to the mainstream knowledge economy. And all of this is to do with people's experiences, because these epistemic resources are developed in order to theorize and understand these experiences. So the enemy is just wrong about that this has nothing to do with our feelings and experiences. It has everything to do. Philosophy has everything to do with our feelings and experiences. So with that enemy in sight, what's the savior? And I think that the savior is someone who I didn't appreciate the religious overtones of this in a Catholic university. Sorry about that. So it's to create a safe space where all voices, not just powerful people's voices, get heard and are welcome. So that there's a space where everyone feels welcome. And that's the only way to demarginalize the marginalized, I think. And this is the subject of a lot of decolonial and epistemic injustice literature. So if you remember, I was understanding decolonizing philosophy precisely as recentering the philosophy enterprise onto the marginalized. And that's how I understood curricular decolonization as well. And that's how I'm going to understand it. So here are some very bad moves that I definitely made. First of all, you start discussions and you hope that in the erroneous belief that everyone's going to somehow reach agreement. So that my white colleague is going to go, oh, yeah, no, you're right, these experiences really do matter. And I think this is it's completely unrealistic because basically you're not going to get this kind of agreement in a world in which white privilege and active ignorance still dominate. It also has the pernicious effect of making everyone feel like we're doing something. Because we're having all of these discussions, we're doing something. Look, we're decolonizing. Whereas, of course, we're just talking about it. We're not actually doing it. And finally, the reason why it's a bad idea to discuss and expect to reach agreement is because colonization itself was a systemic issue, and we need to address it. It's a problem that needs to be solved in a systemic way. So that's why this strategy never worked, and I don't recommend trying it, because it also wastes a lot of time. Second strategy that didn't work was a kind of band-aid approach, where you just throw in a few African, in our case, readings into the philosophy curriculum. You retain everything else, so the hiring practices and the hierarchy and everything else remains the same. And you see how it goes, and that also a bad idea. Some better ideas, which turned out to be ambivalent, so we thought they were good, but it wasn't so clear in the end. So we introduced an African philosophy module, which was super popular, both at the undergraduate and the postgraduate level, and everyone loved it. But it had some seriously dubious consequences to my mind. So first of all, if you're going to call all of these disparate thinkers African philosophy, you're just lumping together all this variety of thought and you essentialize it, right? I mean, Africa is actually a really big place, despite the Mercator maps and the way they made it look small. And it's got a lot of varied thought in it. And it's also got various traditions, not just philosophy, but it's also got epistemology, ethics, and so on. So saying African philosophy and having a module on this, it kind of essentializes the whole enterprise. It also marginalizes African philosophy in a context in which your curriculum looks something like this. This is fortunately not from my university, it's from a Zambian university, but they all look pretty much like this. So you get in year 2, you get African philosophy. In year 3, you get contemporary African thinkers. And then everything else is called philosophy. And everything else, of course, is global north authors. You have contemporary philosophy, philosophy of religion, you have philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, and all of this is philosophy, right? It doesn't need a qualifier. Of course, what it does is suggest that philosophy, this is the main business, and then African philosophy is some exotic, nice historical module or something. So it would be far better to have put in readings from African thinkers in all courses, in epistemology and so on. Second dubious or ambivalent move that I made while I was a head of department was to introduce language tutors. So this was an idea of a colleague of mine, and we all embraced it really beautifully. Like so you would give your lecture in English, and then there would be several African language tutors in the room, and then students would be invited to ask a question in their own language, and then the tutors would translate. And so the idea was that you're making people feel welcome in the discipline, right? That their language is not something outside of the academy. And the thinking was, I mean, the good rationales for this, both from general kind of pedagogical grounds, because people learn better in their own language, and they retain memories better, and performance is better, everything's better. But there was also a decolonial rationale of basically making, like I said earlier, conceptual decolonization is a huge step in the overall decolonization agenda. So if you remember the quotes from the long quote from Kwasi Wiredu, the idea was that your language determines what kinds of issues you find interesting, and what kinds of issues even make sense, and therefore what kind of philosophical problems you're developing. So that was a great aim, but the result was very mixed, to say the least. So some of the students felt that their Sepedi or isiXhosa or isiZulu just wasn't strong enough to discuss philosophical topics. And others, and this was horrible, felt that their language was not actually academic enough in order to discuss these topics. I think this was like they're confusing their own lack of isiZulu or whatever it was with whether the language itself was good enough. But unfortunately, saying this kind of thing, that your language is not academic enough, taps into hideous colonial narratives, right? So only certain languages are good enough for theorizing the high-minded stuff. So while the aim was great, the results were not good for introducing language tutors. And finally, a similar kind of mixed result initiative was a project that we did with Joe Rayer again and a PhD student of mine. And this was to do an African dictionary of philosophy. And the pilot objective was to take some entries that students were, from the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, that students were encountering in their everyday readings and so on, and translate them into various African languages. And the ultimate aim was going to be to compile like a continent-wide dictionary where we solicited entries from various philosophers across the continent. And the result was, I mean, we just didn't realize that what we were doing was going to just completely enforce colonial stereotypes by taking the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy as the paradigm for philosophical terms. So completely reiterating the epistemic authority of the global north, which was precisely the aim of decolonization, to undermine, right? So great. And as you can expect, here's in case you doubt that this is a bad idea, here's one of our translators in isiZulu saying, on the entry on science versus pseudoscience, he said, this stuff that you're making me translate, it's making sound like everything my people believe in, like pseudoscience and witchcraft and stuff. So it's like, great. So, I mean, at the same time, one feels that like it would have been a good, it's a good idea to, like, if students are battling whatever, but that was not the way to go about it. In case you're thinking about it, don't do it. Think of another way. Yeah. So that was the third ambivalent move we made. So at this point, you're probably going, okay, so do we have a point here? We didn't make some better moves. So one of the things that I learned was you need to impose these things from above. So you need to get like all the higher uppers on your side to impose the curricular decolonization from above. And that's basically just a straightforward consequence of the fact that we can't just keep talking about it endlessly and expect agreement. The question then is, well, how do you persuade the higher uppers, given that very often it's not in their interest to do this, right? And the first thing is, again, this was a bad move. Start with like fancy decolonial ideas. Don't do that. So you need to reassure them apparently that it will be fine. Pretty much nothing will change. You don't have to throw out everything, right? It'll just be, I mean, obviously you want to, but it's not the way to persuade them apparently. So you want to rather say that we're not going to abandon everything old, but we're going to be very positive about this. And so first of all, you can show them how, well, doing this kind of work would position the university at the forefront of certain, innovations, like decolonization. And you can, and then we you show them that these are actually it's a very hot topic worldwide. So I'm sorry I didn't research how you guys are doing here, whether there are lots of conferences and so on, but certainly there are lots of conferences worldwide. Even the Royal Institute of Philosophy knows about decolonization now in the UK, which is wow. And then another thing to talk about is how student numbers would rise, and especially the right kind of student numbers, because suddenly students are actually interested. The stuff is like part of their what they're experiencing on a daily basis, right? So it's not just African students, numbers that rose in our case, but also from queer theory, feminist theory, and so on. And the basic idea is that I'm sorry, I've actually lost some stuff here. Okay, so maybe I keep this bit because the other thing that what we can do as philosophers, all of you philosophers out there, is that actually people don't know what decolonization is, really. So we can position the discipline as something that we can work out what it is for you, right? Which, as we know, humanities are threatened around the world, so this is a good thing, right, for survival. So that's one good move, to get stuff imposed from above. The other one is that we need to recurriculate holistically. And the idea is that we want to recenter the entire learning space around student experiences. And these experiences of marginalized people, in South Africa at least, still to this day, Black students are economically and epistemically marginalized. So these experiences of marginalized people living in a racist world. And so everything has to be redone, right? So revising the courses, so by, as I suggested, throwing in, putting scholars, African scholars, in all modules. This is something I did, but again, it was a bit like our mistake in the GPP, because here the concepts that we were analyzing, God, causation, personhood is good because it's a very big topic in philosophy, in African philosophy, but the others, yeah. But anyway, so that was at least a first step. Putting in feminist and Black philosophers in all modules. This is what a colleague of mine did in her modules. Introducing new modules, so apart from African philosophy with qualifiers to other bits of philosophy, I personally introduced philosophy of race, the ethics of race and transformation, and a course on epistemic injustice. And all of these were really, really popular. And they were popular because they spoke to people's marginalization. I also changed my evaluation methods, so a lot of group presentations, and the idea of changing evaluation is that, well, if you're thinking about, like, for example, African students, they come from a culture that is very much communal and oral. So testing them on long essays and just for their writing is basically not tapping at all into their strengths. So what we did is, or at least what I did, is lots of group presentations, and I'll spare you the justification, but lots of, I introduced a poster session as their final exam at the honors level, and it was wonderful actually to see how great, these are some of the posters, which you can't see very well, but it was wonderful how creative people were and what good arguments they were suddenly producing. And I introduced group supervision as well, so apart from being one-on-one supervised, we also have lots and lots of work in progress, workshops, and this creates a beautiful postgraduate community. So here's my team, my nine PhD students, and we don't just drink beer together, but actually they graduate as well. So these are 3 of my PhD students graduating 2 weeks ago. And anyway, so I'm out of my hours, so let me just wrap up. So that just one last initiative is we have an Indigenous Knowledge System portal where one of our colleagues has done various interviews. You can go to our website and have a look at this. The point is, these are the kinds of holistic recurriculation moves that we need to be making, as well as decolonize the spaces, the way our hiring practices, the kind of institutional culture in which we find ourselves, and so on. So this is 2 of, you'll be pleased to hear, competitor universities in South Africa, but they look like, Greek, and that's not a good space for an African student. I won't show you my university. You can ask Edouard and Clark what it looks like. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very inspiring talk. Tenemos unos minutos para preguntas, comentarios, observaciones, así que si alguien quisiera hacerlo, por ejemplo, tenemos ahí una, Carolina, la señorita que está allá, por favor. Si fueran tan amables de levantar la mano para que yo vaya más o menos apuntando a quién vendría después.
Hola, buenos días, muchas gracias. Gracias a la profesora Mitova por su conferencia y gracias, Pablo, por la conferencia en general y al grupo Mentilenguaje también. Tengo una pregunta respecto del método de la investigación. Me gustaría conocer y profundizar más acerca de él. Entiendo que uno de los objetivos de esta investigación es descentralizar la filosofía y bueno, hemos hablado de una descentralización epistémica y conceptual, una descentralización geográfica y de contenido principalmente, pero quisiera saber qué consideraciones hay también para descentrar el método, ¿no? Se ha hablado un poco de eso cuando se mencionó esta aproximación de arriba hacia abajo, ¿no? Desde una posición, desde la misma universidad y el formato de la universidad hacia afuera. Y me gustaría saber qué oportunidad hay en la investigación, no solamente para descentrar el método en términos de formato y conceptualmente, sino también de quién hace las preguntas y quién toma las preguntas o la sartén por el mango, ¿no? ¿Qué oportunidad hay en la investigación para pensar la filosofía occidental desde el punto de vista de otras epistemologías, partiendo desde otras lenguas también, y de otros presupuestos conceptuales y culturales, para que también haya un espacio para evaluar críticamente a la misma filosofía y las pretensiones, entre comillas, de racionalidad de la misma y de sus métodos. Gracias.
I got some of it, I think. So the idea is like, what about not just decolonizing content, but the methods, and
Okay. Yes, please do it. Yes.
Considerably, sorry. Sorry. I live in a majority African black country, so I like the idea of top-down there, right? Which is also in power, right? In political power. But the kinds of opportunities still need to be created in terms of from the academic community, and the problem is that the academic community is still very white-dominated. I mean, my university, for example, is doing very well on that it's not. But as you say, like, what about from the actual indigenous communities? And these are questions that are much better developed in other areas. So like in anthropology and so like scholars in. Sorry, I'm thinking of Linda Smith from Australia, Decolonizing Methodologies, and she's an anthropologist. And there's a budding scholarship in Southern Africa as well. So there's a person in Botswana working on this. Her name is Chalisa Bagele. But for some reason, complete absence of this question in philosophy. So we just got a grant. So in fact, the NHSS that Pablo mentioned, doing philosophy through indigenous knowledges in the Global South. And we're bringing together scholars to think about these topics from that perspective. And it's completely different because so 2 weeks ago we had a workshop at UJ where we put in dialogue like actual indigenous practitioners, like an indigenous lawyer and an indigenous healer, and then a Sepedi specialist with philosophers. But the problem is, because the philosophers are only speaking English, it's again the kind of wrong bunch of indigenous practitioners, right? It's only the ones who are working on the interface between indigenous and Western knowledge. So it's a really good question, and if you want to join us on the project and try and answer it with us, yeah. So I mean, at least I'm hoping that the question is not. Here's a good story about why it hasn't been asked in philosophy. Well, hang on. We have African philosophy. What do you mean? Why? What are we asking, right? So in the field of philosophy, at least, well, it's an easy question to answer. But I don't know how to do it with. Okay, but let's formalize the methodology and how does it compare to how anthropologists, for example, have decolonized their methodology? And yeah, but it's a great question. Thanks.
Ricardo, pues, ¿quieres hacer la pregunta en inglés y luego en castellano? ¿Tú mismo te traduces? Sí.
Hello, Professor. Thanks for your contribution to the project. I had one problem in a very simple definition and concept we use and take it for granted, which is Western philosophy. I'm not sure what exactly is that. Probably it begins with philosophy was born in Athens and in other parts of the world we were doing nothing, right? So it's the same concept of Western philosophy is problematic because I can't grasp it. And I had a question if it's really true that other traditions haven't been exposed. I had the privilege of being a student of Sujata Miris, who's a very known Indian philosopher, and she created a branch of philosophy called philosophy of suffering, which I had never heard of. She's a painter. No, she's a retired professor from Northeastern University in India. But my point is that I was exposed to some other way of thinking, not maybe in epistemology specifically, but yes, in other ways of thinking. In logic, Nyaja's Indian philosophy has given a lot of other views of. So I'm not sure our strategy should begin with epistemology, but to expose ourselves to the 2/6 part of the world that we don't encounter in our courses, Indian philosophy and Chinese philosophy. I mean, I'm trained in analytic philosophy as many of us, but never except my privilege to be student of Professor Miri. So my point is, I'm not sure what are our strategies into questioning just epistemology, but maybe exposing ourselves to other traditions.
Can you say it in Spanish as well, please?
Bueno, en castellano no entendí nada, mi propia pregunta en inglés, pero más o menos la idea es que tenemos una deficiencia de no haber sido expuestos a otro tipo de filosofías antes de hablar de epistemología, que es obviamente el tema que está dentro del proyecto de Geography and Philosophy. Pero yo tuve la suerte de ser educado con una famosa profesora india y empecé a entender que había otros otros temas, ¿no? En este caso era filosofía del sufrimiento. El tema parecía hasta mórbido, pero era una cosa interesante, iluminadora y edificante para mí como estudiante de pregrado. Y creo que parte del problema puede empezarse estratégicamente, no quizás cuestionando, porque tenemos la idea de que a los médicos no podemos enseñarles 100 tipos de prácticas y que algunas son problemáticas, ¿no? Las parteras pueden ser una tradición en el Perú, pero pueden ser también un problema de mortandad infantil peligrosísima, ¿no? Hay parteras que parten cordón umbilical con una piedra, ¿no? Entonces puede ser eso también problemático cuando uno abre las puertas a, miren, todas estas son prácticas correctas y respetemos cada cultura y cada modo de ser, ¿no? Entonces, solamente mi preocupación era la definición de Occidente, porque vivo en un país que no sé si Occidente es un terno o pensar de una manera. O sea, una persona chánica es occidental, vive en el territorio peruano. Nuestro país está diseñado con una constitución de corte kantiano, ¿no? O sea, las primeras partes son de una moral kantiana. ¿Somos occidentales todos? Esa es la parte que no me queda clara. Yo empezaba, en el fondo, por la pregunta sobre Occidente. My question really was devoted to the concept of Western and Western philosophy, because it doesn't come clear in your country. I don't know how you handle who are Westerners,
Okay.
and we tend to think in white people, and that's offensive in some sense. Thank you, thank you, and congratulations,
Okay.
Professor.
Thank you. So on the Western question, there's like a huge, well, not a huge, but an increasing interest in that question, and like people arguing that actually the very construct of Western philosophy is itself colonial, because to a great extent, first of all the stuff that went into Western philosophy is completely pillaged from the East in any case. So just to be clear on that, who the Westerns are, I think it's pretty. That's why I kept switching to global North. But basically, you can just say, you can replace everything I want to say with the previous colonizers. And I think that would just go nicely. So in the context of this kind of, where we're trying to get rid of certain things that are both epistemically and morally harmful, I think that it's very clear what we're trying to get rid of, right? And we're certainly trying to get rid of the idea that this will be called philosophy, and then everything else will be Indian philosophy, South African philosophy, Chinese, Okay, so I think that's, but I think that your concern about calling it Western philosophy is a legitimate one, because it itself taps into certain colonial patterns. Starting with the epistemology story, so I think that epistemology has a foundational role in not as a discipline, but in colonization. Conceptual colonization and epistemic colonization was an intrinsic part of the success of the colonizing mission or whatever. So the colonizing mission was the civilizing mission, where people were supposed to be savages, they were irrational, their science was witchcraft, their metaphysics was superstition. These are all epistemic claims. You don't have knowledge. I am the custodian of knowledge, you are not. And that's why I think that the epistemic decolonization is essential to the decolonial project. And in this way, if you're going to start questioning assumptions about concepts, starting with epistemic concepts, these essential concepts, is a really good idea, I think. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution to the project. I have two brief questions. The first one is, my concern is about which is the impact of this project on ethics, especially does it ground it forever a moral relativism? And the second question is, what are your thoughts about the problem of demarcation between science and pseudoscience? Español, pero el auditorio es peruano. La primera pregunta fue sobre el impacto que puede tener en relativizar la moral este proyecto, que es, lo entiendo y me parece muy interesante. Y lo segundo es pedirle los comentarios a la profesora sobre el problema de demarcación entre la ciencia y pseudociencia. ¿Qué comentarios tiene sobre eso?
Cool, thanks. So on the demarcation problem, I don't have any thoughts on the general version of the demarcation problem. I do have a lot of thoughts on expertise. So I've just recently read a paper, and I think that, written a paper, where if certain kinds of expertise turns out to be, that's clearly scientific, turns out to be non-scientific by certain kinds of criteria for science, then you should reject those criteria for science. So that's at least the colonial version of, I think, the demarcation problem. As for moral relativism, I don't know what the big eminent PIs think about moral relativism. I'm personally highly opposed to it, and I don't think that there's a direct line from understanding that certain concepts are not universal to being a relativist of any kind. But I can see why someone would want to say that, because then, you know, if truth, for example, is a relative concept, then how do we, you know, judge? But it's a huge question, and then maybe you can ask it again between 6 and 7 tonight.
With a pisco sour. Pueden formular preguntas en castellano también y yo podría traducirle a la doctora Mitova. ¿Algún otro comentario, alguna otra pregunta?
Great. So, it seems to be working. It's a fairly general question, not about decolonizing philosophy, but about decolonizing knowledge more broadly. And it's a bit of a naive question, so you'll forgive me. But when it's not working, I just should speak louder. All right. So the question is not about decolonizing philosophy, but decolonizing knowledge more broadly. So when I look today about knowledge production, so the main place for knowledge production is not the West. In fact, and the main place for knowledge production in the next 20 years is not going to be the West, it's China. Most of the scientific articles written these days are written in China. It's very clear that within 5 to 10 years, much of the knowledge produced in the world will not be produced at all in the West. It's very clear that in 20 or 30 years from now, Mandarin will be the dominant language in knowledge production. It's the same is true, of course, of Japanese. The same is true of Korean. You know, Singapore, to some extent, is one of the dominant places for scientific research done in the world, engineering, and so on and so forth, AI. How does that quite fit? I mean, you know, and so it's true for the humanities, true for philosophy, but more broadly for knowledge production, it's just not the case anymore that the West is at the center of knowledge production. It's not going true. In 20 years, China will be the center of knowledge production. So how does that quite fit with the project of decolonizing knowledge? In science, knowledge has been decolonized. It's Chinese knowledge. I mean, I think it's a fact of the matter. There's just no way to debate about that. They're producing the knowledge. Now, they might be using some Western categories. I think that's an interesting question. But they are producing it.
Thanks, Edouard. So that doesn't, in my book, count as decolonizing knowledge, because decolonizing knowledge means that it gets produced by the previously colonized. So there's a very specific historical narrative that's had in mind here, like of the actual colonial sites restoring their own epistemic authority and becoming themselves producers of knowledge. And that's compatible with like other people doing so as well, as long as they're not being dominated by the West. Now, I think I might want to actually dispute your claim about dominating knowledge production, because if you look at like AI development and so on, that's very much driven by the global North. And the kinds of, that's why you get like stereotype, sorry, not stereotyped, right? Sorry, my jet lag is kicking in. That's why you get algorithmic bias and like all of these things, like where that generates like racist images and racist judgments and so on. It's not because it's being produced in China. but because a lot of this stuff is being, like all the AI models are being trained on global north data.
Well, the one we have access to, right?
Okay.
China has its own AI models.
Okay.
It's widely developed. AI has been widely used in China for facial recognition for years now.
Okay.
It's ChatGPT, just because this is what we have access to for free.
That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's but China, of course, was colonized to some extent. I mean, it was not quite colonized in the way India was colonized, but it was invaded and reinvaded by Europeans. We destroyed French people, and Brits destroyed large part of Beijing. So why somehow they turning themselves into a center of knowledge production doesn't it count as a form of decolonization?
I mean, I don't know the exact colonial history there, but like usually when we talk about colonization, it is specific to the global south, and like to these kinds of locations. But yeah, I'll have to read up more on. But at all events, like global decolonization would involve every ex-colonial site starting to contribute to knowledge production and being free of the kind of oppressive epistemic resources that we're still very much using. But yeah, it's a good point.
I'd like to ask you a question that is a follow-up from what Ricardo and Edward said. Me voy a autotraducir. Voy a hacer una pregunta que es una continuación de lo que dijo Ricardo y lo que ha dicho Edward. Y es que hay un sentido en el que lo que llamamos Occidente es como un agujero negro que devora todo lo que es considerado interesante. Por ejemplo, ¿hasta qué punto Japón no es un país totalmente occidentalizado? ¿No? Bueno, Japón también ha sido un país colonizador, ha colonizado a China y otros países vecinos, pero al día de hoy Japón es un país totalmente occidentalizado. Entonces hay una paradoja acá, porque incluso la reflexión sobre descolonización también en cierto sentido viene de países que alguna vez fueron colonizadores. Es verdad que en Latinoamérica la reflexión sobre descolonización viene desde los años 70, luego pasó un largo periodo en el que no hubo mucho interés en el tema y ha regresado, pero ha regresado desde el norte nuevamente, ¿no? Do you see what I mean?
I'm not following everything. So
Okay, I will translate it. Yeah, I was saying that I find very interesting what Ricardo and Edward said, because the West is like a huge black hole that devours everything that is considered relevant. Like, for instance, Japan could be regarded as a Western country. It's completely Western right now. And even the very notion of decolonization, which started to some extent in Latin America in the 70s, was forgotten in the 80s and 90s, and now it comes back, but it comes back from the north as well. So there is a paradox, but my question is it a bad paradox or is it fine? I mean, I don't have any objection in that true and important insights come from previous colonizers if they are going to free ourselves from very old colonial prejudices. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I'm just not sure why you think that the current debate is coming from the north, because like there's a lot of stuff going on in Africa as well. So yeah. I mean, maybe here you guys feel that you've done your bit, but actually, yeah. I mean, let me not comment on this. Right? Certainly in Africa, it's a huge topic of conversation.
Just one thing, but the fact is that we are not familiar at all of what is going on in Africa about decolonization, and that's our fault, not your fault. That's our fault. We are not familiar. I became familiar with this stuff just in the project of the geography of philosophy. I mean, that, in a sense, that changed my academic life too. Because I was working on philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, I was always interested in doing something related to Peru, but I didn't know how to do it, and perhaps it's something you feel as well. And the Geography of Philosophy project helped me to understand what I could do to integrate my philosophical interests and also my own country. And that's how I met you. And I discovered that there is a lot of philosophy going on in Africa that I just had no idea. It was so important, and it was decolonizing. So, okay, my point would be, yes, there is this project we are engaged in, which is not only the Geography of Philosophy project, but decolonization as well. And it is related to globalization, because decolonization is not possible without some degree of globalization too. No? It was just a comment.
No, thanks.
¿Algún otro comentario, pregunta? Todavía tenemos un poco de tiempo. Sí.
Mi pregunta es, muchísimas gracias por el espacio para compartir, y gracias, Pablo, también por tus reflexiones. Me parece súper importante que tengamos esa capacidad dentro de la academia de asumir que no tenemos la capacidad de conocerlo todo, ¿no? E incluso dentro de un espacio como la Facultad de Letras y Ciencias Humanas, la carrera de Filosofía, que yo, al menos siendo estudiante de filosofía, en algún momento sentía esas ínfulas de saberlo todo. Y me parece muy importante el espacio que se está abriendo ahora, y mi pregunta es, ¿qué podemos hacer para conocer? ¿Qué podemos hacer para aproximarnos? What we can do to approach to decolonization, to this philosophy of South Africa, even though Latin American philosophy, even though Peruvian philosophy. You said that we need to change our curriculum, but it seems that that's so difficult, because when we as students maybe propose something to our faculty, a nuestra faculty, there are a lot of obstacles. So with some afraid, I'm afraid, and tengo un poco de miedo de decir esto, pero cuando yo era estudiante, siempre habían estas conversaciones. ¿Por qué no tenemos un obligatorio de filosofía latinoamericana? ¿Por qué no tenemos un obligatorio de filosofía feminista, decolonial? ¿Por qué no conocemos pensamiento indígena? ¿Por qué no tenemos un obligatorio de filosofía de África del Sur? Y no salía de los círculos de estudiantes, y éramos nosotras, quienes compartíamos esa información de manera muy íntima. Por eso me parece tan valiosa este espacio y el aporte de Pablo, al reconocer que todavía nos falta y no podemos conocer. And I include in that ignorance of not knowing the South Africa philosophy. I know partial of Latin American philosophy because I'm interested in that. But I thank you a lot for that.
Thank you. I think you need to graduate quickly and get a post. So, I mean, unfortunately, that's how it works, right? So, like, we have to let some time pass where people like you are being qualified and then can change the thing from within, that are in positions of power to do it. Because the best way to do it is exactly from that kind of perspective, from your perspective, rather than, I mean, so despite my talk about imposing it from above, what I mean by that is, like, we need to get, like, the powers that be on our side, right, in order to push the curricular change through. But the people who will do that, you know, you. So you just need to.
Entonces tenemos que seguir intentándolo, tocando puertas,
Yeah.
juntándonos, intercambiando.
Well, I mean, I guess some of the, like, for example, this event is a step in the right direction, because you will be hearing an expert later on Peruvian philosophy, on, like, old Peruvian philosophy. That's right. And so you're already doing some of that, but I completely hear you. It's exhausting. And when you're in a marginalized position, it's exhausting in triple ways, right? Because you know in advance how harmful it will be to your career, like how emotionally exhausting it will be, and you know the kind of response you're going to meet up front. And epistemic injustice people have a term for that, epistemic exploitation, right? When, you know, like, you know, we keep saying, so tell us about your marginalized experience. And then it's like, no, I think you've got this wrong. Like, we're a good university. We're good professors. We wouldn't do that to you. And so I hear you completely. I don't know what the answer is. Other than keep going and, you know, get quick to the position of power.
Bueno, creo que vamos a quedarnos aquí. Volvemos con una mesa donde van a estar Gianfranco Casuso, Víctor Masi y Miguel Rodríguez Mondoñedo. Así que muchísimas gracias a la profesora Beli Mitova.